Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to the webinar today. It looks like just about everybody has made it from the waiting room to the main room. So thank you for coming. Yeah, thank you for those of you who are already doing it. Just type in hello. You can put your location, which country you're located in or which city, and that will also confirm that you can hear and that the audio is working properly. We did a test audio a few minutes ago. Everything was working fine. So if there are any issues with audio, most likely it's on your end, not on mine, okay? But please just put a quick hello into the chat box. Uh, It'll also give you a chance to locate the chat box, which we'll be using from time to time on the webinar today. There's going to be some questions I'll ask you to answer and things like that. And of course, there'll be some time for questions at the end. So just a couple of housekeeping issues before we get started. The session is being currently recorded, and the recording link will be sent to you within the next couple of days. So you can watch the webinar again if you missed something, or you can share it with friends and colleagues at your convenience. The second issue is the certificates. They'll be sent out within a week, so not within the next couple of days, but you should have received your certificate by Tuesday, the 2nd of April. Again, that'll be sent via email with a link to your personalized certificate. And lastly, questions. I mentioned a moment ago, we're going to have time for questions at the end of the session. I'm also going to try and stick a short question and answer section kind of into the middle because it is a 60-minute webinar, and it might be good to get some questions that are that come up kind of halfway through. So we should have two sections for questions, one kind of in the middle and then one at the end. So my name is John Wolf. I've been teaching English as a foreign language since 2006. I started out working in a private language school, and from there I moved into a public secondary school, and currently I work at a public university in Wrocław, Poland. And that's also where I've lived since 2007. And I've been pretty lucky with the jobs that I've had because I've received quite a bit of training, including training in different exam skills areas. I was also a speaking examiner for Cambridge First. And as I mentioned before, I've received quite a bit of training myself, and I'm going to pass on some of those ideas to you in the webinar today. And here's the topics that we're going to cover. Those should be numbered 1 through 6. I'm not sure what happened with the file conversion, but those should be numbered 1 through 6. And in these 6 areas, we're going to start a bit more theoretical and then move slowly into the practical. And the topic being how we can enjoy, as teachers, what we can do to enjoy teaching an exam course, right? This is the topic we're looking at today. And all of these points relate back to different ways that we can take pleasure in our jobs, ways that we can reduce stress levels, make our work easier, work more efficiently, things like that. And I've done my best to include 5 or 6 practical ideas that you can take with you from the webinar today. So these are the 6 areas that we're going to be focusing on. Again, moving from the theoretical, from the more theoretical to the much more practical. And just to give you an idea, a couple kind of the premises that that I created this webinar on have to do with things like job satisfaction. The idea that I had in mind was if we can enjoy our jobs more, obviously that will lead to higher levels of job satisfaction, which in turn helps to avoid burnout. And burnout is a serious epidemic, serious problem in the teaching field. The last statistics that I read about burnout, U.S. teachers typically experience some degrees of burnout in the first 5 years, within the first 5 years of their careers. And as a lot of you know, 5 years for any career is not really that long, especially with teaching, right? I think after about 5 years is when we really start to, we just begin to kind of perfect the methods and techniques that we use in the classroom. So avoiding burnout and enjoying the course can help to avoid burnout, lead to higher job satisfaction, and hopefully lead to more successful students. And the final premise that I created this webinar on was essentially that happy teachers equal happy students, and vice versa. Enjoyment is kind of a two-way street, and in my experience, if my students are enjoying things, normally I am as well, right? So those are some of the premises and the ideas that I had in mind when I created this webinar. So let's get started. And step one is this: deflating the pressure. And with an exam course comes pressure and stress. And there's different sources of this stress and of this pressure. And if you think about the exam course that you're teaching, or an exam course that you taught in the past, could you please just type into the chat box what might be a reason why you have felt pressure or felt stressed out from your exam course in the past? Just give us one idea in the chat box, please. Time. A lot of people talking about time. Okay, the time limit. Yeah, yeah. Okay, okay. A lot of people. Too little time. Absolutely. Okay, demotivated students. Yeah, not doing homework. That is extremely frustrating. I have to say, especially when there are students who need the extra practice, right? It can be very, very frustrating. Yeah, a lot of people talking about time. Somebody mentioned levels as well. Some of the ideas that I had from my experience are here. And one area that I found is pressure. I feel kind of responsible to a certain degree for my students' citizen failures. I think I feel more responsible when they fail than I do when they succeed. But especially on a standardized exam, there is a lot of pressure on students and teachers to get results, and we can feel that pressure, I think, especially as the exam gets closer. The second one, I probably should have added thoroughly covering all parts of the exam, right? And this relates directly back to what a lot of you put into the chat box about having time, right? There isn't always enough time to thoroughly cover every part of an exam. I mean, if you think about writing, for instance, right? A lot of standardized tests have a number of different compositions that might show up on exam day, and it's difficult for us as teachers in the time that we have to cover all those types of compositions, right? This is just one example of how it can be quite stressful, and sometimes it can feel pretty impossible to thoroughly cover all parts of the exam, especially with writing when you think about how realistic some writing tasks can be on exams. The third thing I thought of was keeping students engaged, making the content interesting. That obviously can be a pretty big challenge, I think, and can cause quite a bit of pressure and stress to us as teachers. And then finally, mixed abilities. Somebody kind of mentioned, I think in the chat box, somebody put, mixed ability groups. That can be a big issue when everybody's, set to take the exam in May or in April. And not only that, but I've had groups, exam classes that I've taught before, where not everybody is even going to take the exam, which can be extremely frustrating, especially as the exam approaches, and especially as you're starting to run more and more exam practice as the year moves on, and people who aren't actually doing the exam not really that interested in what's happening in class. Not only students who are or are not taking the exam, but for some state school exams, which everybody has to take. I know in Poland, the end of high school English exam is offered at 2 different levels, and not everybody takes it at the same level, right? So that can also pose a challenge to us as teachers, and can also cause some stress and some pressure on us. So one way to avoid or to alleviate some of this pressure, to deflate some of this pressure, is by using low language activities in class, or non-language activities in class. Which might sound a little bit strange to you. And a low language activity is any kind of activity that is not linguistically demanding for students, right? We're not asking them to do a lot with English for these activities. And I'm not suggesting that we should have lots and lots of these low or non-language activities, but I would recommend including some stages of a lesson that include, for example, planning time in students L1. Which can be a little bit of a break from English, and it gives us teachers a bit of a break as well. But some benefits to low language activities. It can take the focus off the exam and put the focus more on the activity itself. It can also provide review of vocabulary, for instance, and also they still can provide practice with language, but not as intensely as a typical kind of activity might. And finally, some of these low language activities, including the one that I'm going to show you, it requires students to manage the activity themselves to a certain extent. And that gives students a chance to develop their interpersonal skills, which gets pretty interesting, I think, in a group of secondary students, where in a group you have students in groups of 3 or 4, and they're responsible for kind of managing the logistics of the activity themselves. It gets very, very interesting to see how students can manage in that situation. So one example of low language activities, tic-tac-toe, or noughts and crosses, right, in British English. Which is a game most people know. I think everybody probably does. Students certainly know it. It's tic-tac-toe with a twist, we can say. And the way that I run this activity in class is I first demo the activity, and then I break students into groups to do the activity themselves. And when we demo the activity, I divide my group into 2 halves. So, for example, excuse me. Okay, left side of the room, you're going to be X's. Right side of the room, you're going to be O's. Okay, X's, which square would you like? And I draw the tic-tac-toe grid on the board. So X's, there's a captain of the team. Somebody says, oh, we would like the center square, right? Okay, center square, here's your definition. And I'll have a vocab list ready, and I'll read them a definition of a random word on the list, and they have to guess what the word is. If they're correct, they get the square. If they're incorrect, they don't get the square, and then it's the other team's turn. They do the same thing until the board is full and somebody's won the game. And then after I've demoed the activity once is enough. I'll split the students into groups of 3. Groups of 3 are ideal for this because one person is the game master, and they have the list, they're giving definitions, and the other 2 students are playing the game. So they play around, and then they change roles. Someone else is now the game master, and the 2 other students play the game. It works very well for reviewing vocabulary. It can also be used to review and practice verb forms, collocations, and also for word formations, which does appear on a lot of English exams. With the word formations version, instead of giving a definition of a word, you give a word, for example, in the verb form, and the answer has to be in the noun form, for example. It's another kind of variation. So it's a game that I like to play occasionally. As I said before, it's good for vocab review, but it can be adapted to a lot of different language points. And it's not extremely linguistically demanding for students. If you're the game master, it's a bit more demanding because you have to think of the definitions. But the game master is only game master for one game, and then they switch. And they get a little bit of a break, a little bit of a rest, where they just have to kind of process information and then come up with a target word or target phrase. So this is what I mean by a low language activity. Okay, moving on to the second step, monitoring progress. Previously, we had. Let me just pause for one moment. There's a question about. How about students doing these definitions? Obviously, this would be an activity for practicing vocabulary, not presenting. So the definitions, they can work on them beforehand in groups, or if you have strong enough students, they can improvise and come up with the definitions on the spot. That would be one way to deal with the definitions. So moving on to monitoring progress. There was a previous webinar, I think it was step 3 on monitoring progress. So I'm going to make this step brief. But I did have an idea in one way to make our lives a little bit easier when we run exam courses, and that idea is running tutorials. And a tutorial is a one-to-one meeting with a student, a one-to-one or two-to-one meeting with the student, and the idea is to open up a line of communication to have with students, especially in terms of where they are in the course. Are they ready for the exam? Are they not ready for the exam? What are some areas that need to be improved, and so on. And I first encountered these tutorials working for a language school, and we would do tutorials halfway through the school year after our midterm tests. So we would have, I would walk into the tutorial with the student with their test in hand. We would use that as kind of a springboard, and I would give some suggestions and some recommendations on areas for improvement, and discussing progress as well. And a tutorial is one way to assure that teachers and students are on the same page, and they both are aware of where that student is in terms of their readiness to take an exam. And the result of that could be students working a little bit harder at home. Maybe, I mean, somebody mentioned before, getting students to do homework is an issue. Of course it is. But I think the most we can do is to do our jobs as completely as possible as teachers, and communicating to students that they need more work in a certain area is one way to do that. And a tutorial is a good chance for that. Some other ideas for monitoring progress, tracking exam practice results, so students can kind of see their listening scores hopefully going up through the course of the semester. Running mock exams, a full mock exam is something that I think a lot of schools do. One of the schools I worked at, we ran courses from October to June, and we ran mock exams in March. A full mock exam, we ran speaking on a separate day, and based on those results, we would give students recommendations on whether or not they should take the test. This is something that has to be, not has to be, but it could be organized by the entire school. It can also be organized by individual teachers. And if you have short lessons, 45-minute lessons or 90-minute lessons, you can do individual papers, right? You can do a listening paper, half of a writing paper, for example, in one lesson. Okay, so moving on from monitoring progress, managing exam practice is the next area that I think we can really do ourselves a favor in terms of keeping our kind of happiness levels up, not stressing out too much about exam practice. And what I mean by managing exam practice, we're going to look at big picture exam practice management briefly, and then kind of, we could say, micromanaging exam practice. So I have a question for everybody. How often should we give exam practice, or how often do you give exam practice? Could you please type your answers into the chat box? Okay, regularly. Yeah, Helena, how regularly? Every week? Every month? Okay, there. Yeah, Alejandro. Depending on the extent of the course. Yeah, exactly. Absolutely, it depends, right? And that leads me to my next question. It depends. Okay, how about in October? Assuming this is a kind of typical school year kind of schedule. So starting in September, October, finishing in May or June. How often should we give exam practice in October? As often as possible. Every lesson means every week. Okay. Bojan, 2 to 3 mock exams per semester. Okay, that's a lot. Not too much though, in my opinion. As often as possible. Not after holidays. Okay. Okay, yeah, Dana, as a diagnostic tool. Yeah, very nice. The next question is, how about in April as the exam approaches? And I think you guys probably get the idea. The point that I want to make is it should increase in frequency as the exam gets closer. But if we look at a course that starts in September or October, there's some things that we need to do before we introduce exam practice, because it's not always the best idea to give students exam practice and then analyze and dissect how the exam is structured, good answers, bad answers, and things like that. That's one approach. But another approach is to give students some tools right before they start the exam. And the biggest issue, the biggest way we can help students is to familiarize them with the exam, from the structure of the entire exam down to the individual tasks. So I have a little gap fill for you. Please do not type your answers for this into the chat box. You can just think about them, or you can write them down on a separate piece of paper. These are some questions that students might ask about how exams and how exam tasks are structured. Just take about 60 seconds to please complete these gaps. Again, don't put your answers in the chat box. Just write them down on a separate piece of paper, or you can just think about them. Okay, so here's the answers, or the completed questions, let's say, and some of these apply to different papers in an exam. For example, what kinds of words go in these gaps? Well, that could apply obviously to a use of English tasks, where some gaps are grammar words, some gaps are content words, but that could also apply to a listening, right? A gap listening in a note-taking format, for example, and students can predict what type of word goes in that gap. Is it a noun, an adjective? Is it a time, a place, a person, and so on. I'm not going to go through each of these questions, but questions 1 and 9 are both about the rubric, right? How will students be assessed on this exam? And for some parts of the exam, it's a matter of points. For some, it's a matter of a whole marking scheme, right? For speaking and writing, it's a matter of different areas they'll be assessed in. And we're going to go into that a little bit later on with writing. But these are just some areas, right? So managing exam practice, first and foremost, means familiarizing students as early as possible and as well as we can with the exam format and the task types that they're going to see on the exam. And it's not all on our shoulders, right? You see a lot of these, this is from Gold's, and we can see lots of exam tips, these kind of salmon colored boxes about the exam, some exam strategies as well are included in some printed materials. And not only in forms of those little boxes, but oftentimes, oftentimes we get full page or double page spreads on, in this case, a writing focus. And one thing we can see here, which is absolutely crucial, I think, for writing and speaking exam tasks, is a sample, right? Is a model for what the tasks should look like. This one's been analyzed for language and structure for the writing test. So managing exam practice, watching the frequency. Somebody here mentioned exam phobia, right? Too many mock exams can cause exam phobia. And that's certainly something we would want to avoid. And one way of doing that is taking a step-by-step approach to kind of easy learners into these exam tasks. Instead of just kind of throwing an exam task at them and saying, okay, do your best and we'll talk later. This is an alternative kind of approach. Okay, the next section, readying your repertoire, is going to start to get much more practical. We're going to look at some activities in the next 3 steps, some activities that you can class to make your job a little bit easier, and also to help students to enjoy an exam course, as well as teachers, as well as having us enjoy the courses themselves. And readying your repertoire means having a bag of tricks that we all have for most of our classes, having a bank of activities that we can use that will still provide meaningful exam practice or exam type practice for students, not just exam tasks, but kind of mimicking some exam tasks as well. So we're going to look at 2 activities. The first one is going to be for speaking. And I need everybody to please take out a piece of paper and a pen if you don't already have one. And I'm going to describe a picture. I'd like you to draw the picture. Okay? So for all you artists out there, it's your chance to shine. I'm going to describe the picture and ask you to draw it. Okay? So here we go. In the picture, here we go. In the picture, I can see a girl in a blue shirt who is playing the piano. And this must be a piano lesson because I can also see 3 other young people in the picture behind the girl, and they're also playing the piano. In front of the girl, there's sheet music, which is on top of the piano. And standing next to the girl in the blue shirt, watching her, is an older lady who must be her teacher. Okay, in the interest of time, I'm just going to show you the original. Is that what your picture looks like? That's what your picture should look like. And this picture is taken from I think it's an FCE speaking test, describing pictures in the individual long-term turn part two, where students are asked to compare and contrast two pictures. So this activity is called a drawing dictation. Some of you are probably familiar with it. And a drawing dictation works in this way. So I'll model the activity, I'll describe a picture, and the students have to draw it. I'll show them the original, and we do kind of a find the differences activity with a few examples from students. And then it's the student's turn to do the same thing in pairs. So you can take pictures that come from exam prep books. You can take any picture that happens to show up in your normal kind of course book, because course books are full of pictures, and some of them are very useful to describe, right? The other source for pictures could be if your students have appropriate pictures on their phones, they could use some of those. That could be a little bit tricky in terms of using phones in the classroom. But you can also have students draw the pictures themselves. And this is something that I would definitely do as a low language or non-language activity with younger learners. If we're doing a lesson on furniture, for example, I would ask students, after modeling the task, I would ask them, okay, you've got 5 minutes, draw a picture of your room and include all the furniture and the clothes and everything. And they use that picture as the picture they described to their partners for the drawing dictation. So it's a lesson that you could bring, sorry, an activity that you could bring some extra materials in for, but you can also use the materials that are already kind of around you in the classroom. And it is an exam type of task, right? It's kind of disguised, semi-cleverly disguised, I guess. Some of the benefits, it's a adaptable activity to really any kind of target vocabulary, as long as you can get or you can draw a picture of it, right? Absolutely, it practices prepositions of place. It's a good speaking fluency activity. It's also a pretty authentic activity because to draw the picture, they have to hear the instructions, understand the instructions, and maybe ask for clarification as well, right? Which creates a little bit of a different kind of interaction pattern that students don't always engage in the classroom. Practicing present continuous for actions that are seen in the picture, working on collocations. There's a lot of different language points and lexical sets that can be practiced or that come out of this activity. And again, the feedback is comparing the drawing to the original and doing a kind of find the differences activity. So in picture A, I can see this. In picture B, I can see that, and encouraging students to use that language, right? In picture one, in picture two, in picture A, in picture B, that really starts to look much more like an exam task. So this is one idea that you can, one activity that you can put in your repertoire, and it's something, in my experience, that students are very happy to do. Not every lesson, obviously, right? This isn't a whole methodology for teaching, but it's something they're happy to do multiple times throughout the semester. Certainly, after you've spent a lesson or two introducing a new lexical set, for example, this could be a really nice way to practice that lexical set. The second activity is for writing practice. And again, I'm going to show you. I'd like you to do the activity with me because it does work in the webinar format. So I'm going to ask you to do the activity, and then we'll kind of take a step back, and I'll explain how this actually looks in class. Okay. But for this writing activity, I'm going to tell you a story. Okay, it's a story about my life, not the story of my life, but just a story from my life. But I'm not going to tell you the whole story. I'm just going to give you the first line of the story, the first sentence in the story. After you see the first sentence of the story, your job is to get as much information as you can about my story by typing questions into the chat box. So here we go. Last month, I visited my family in San Diego, California. Please type your questions into the chat box, and I'll answer them as quickly as I can. Okay, I'm gonna stop there. Thank you very much for all the questions. I couldn't quite answer them fast enough. And somebody put a really difficult question. Why do you live so far away from your family? That's a tough question. This is the first part of the activity, right? Is getting as much information as you can by asking questions about the first line of the story. And let me just take a step back now and explain how I would run this in class, because in class there's no chat box. In class, I split the group, I put the students in pairs. Each pair gets one piece of paper. I write the first sentence of the story on the board, and then students with their partners write questions on their piece of paper. So when they've written one question, they raise their hands, and I come over to that pair, read the question. If the question is grammatically correct, I answer it in short form, right? Much like I've done in the chat box here with short answers. If there's a mistake in the question, I underline where there's a mistake. And then I go to the next group. So the teacher's role in this activity is bouncing around different pairs as they raise their hand and answering questions or underlining mistakes in questions. I let this run until each group has maybe 4 or 5 questions, right? Not too long, right? Not too long, because eventually we're going to ask students to do this activity as well. And then after the initial stage, what you end up with is this, right? Students will have something like this on their worksheet. The questions in blue they've written, the answers in black were my answers, for example. So now with their partner, the task is turn your questions and answers into a story, right? Make this a fluent, cohesive kind of story. It'll be a short story, right? Which is fine, right? This is just to demo the activity and give students a little bit of writing practice. So their stories will be quite short. So however much time they need, 5, 6, maybe 7 minutes to write the stories, one story per pair. And then one option for feedback at that point is to swap stories with another pair and look for information that they didn't have, because each pair of students has different questions, right? This is one option. The next stage, now it's the student's turn to do the activity. So each student gets their own piece of paper, and each student writes the first line of a trip they took on a piece of paper. And it doesn't have to be a vacation abroad. A student could write, last weekend I went to the movies with my best friend Sam, right? When I was 12, I went to Italy on holiday with my family. It can be any kind of story. It doesn't have to be a family trip or a school trip. I mean, those are just some possibilities. It just needs to be a story from the past, a real story, a true story from the past. So they write on their piece of paper. They write their sentence, the first line of their story at the top, and then they swap papers with the partner and they start writing questions. They're writing questions about their partner's story. And they can write one question, pass the paper back, get the answer, get the paper back, write another question, or they can write 5 questions, give the paper to their partner, answer those 5 questions, give it back, and write 5 more, for example. It's up to you and how you want to work this activity. But again, what the students end up with is something like this, and they're going to turn their questions and answers into a story. And the story they write is not the story about their trip. They're going to write the story of their partner's trip. So the worksheet they have, the worksheet they create the story from, is with the questions that they wrote, right? Their partners have answered the questions they wrote. So they're going to write the stories, not their own stories. They write their partner's stories. And feedback at that point, it depends on how you want to run the activity, of course. You can post the stories around the room and have students read them to see which one is the most interesting, or see which one contains, if you've taken a similar trip in your life, you can pass them around the room, or you can collect them, right? Collect them, mark them, hand them back next lesson, right? This is also an option. So a couple of things that I like about this writing activity, it's basically materials free, right? Completely materials free. You need a story, which I think everybody has, and you need students. And this is also something I like about the activity. It's very student-centered. Even when students are asking questions about the teacher's story, they're still collaborating with a partner, writing their own questions. So it is still quite student-centered. And it also kind of takes advantage of the resources that students bring into class. their life experiences are a valuable tool that we can use in different ways in the language classroom. And this is one way of doing it. It's gradable to different levels, and it does have adaptable forms of feedback. As I mentioned before, you can do as much or as little feedback as you like. And in terms of collecting the stories and marking them, we're going to look at that a little bit later in the session in the last step, making the most out of marking. So those were two activities that you can put into your teaching repertoire, one for speaking, one for writing. The writing activity works really well after some kind of break from school, right? So if you have some kind of winter holiday, if you have other long weekends, things like that, it's a good time to come back. Okay, let's do the stories lesson. And I've done this so far. I'm teaching two groups right now. Well, I'm teaching several groups right now, but I've done this specifically with two groups who need to improve their writing. We've done it twice so far, and we started classes in October, and we've already done it twice. So I'll probably do it once again before they take an exam. They are going to take an exam in May, so we'll probably do it one more time before the exam. Okay. So moving on. In fact, are there any questions on the last couple of steps that we've gone over? Is there any questions I can answer now? Definitely. I would do this for all levels. In fact, I think the difference is going to be the type of feedback that you focus on, and maybe the time that you allow to do the task, possibly. But I think PET, FCE, and higher as well, right? I wouldn't hesitate to do this with higher levels. At all classes as well, yeah, Helena, I totally agree. The students that I mentioned before are they range in age from 18 to 30, and they really enjoy it. Writing a review, yeah, I think it is adaptable to different genres of writing. I did only present this version as telling stories, but the question could simply be in terms of writing a review, which we're going to look at actually later in the session. The question could be, last weekend I went to such and such restaurant and the food was awful. Okay, get more information, and then turn those questions and answers into a full review, if that's what you meant by review. Yeah, to a mixed ability class, I think one way to address mixed abilities is going to be pairing students effectively. So potentially putting stronger students with weaker students, and I think what would happen in that kind of dynamic is the stronger students would provide a bit more support, especially in terms of writing questions and turning those questions and answers into a full, cohesive story. That could be one way to deal with mixed abilities. Essays as well. I think so. Yeah, it is. It is adaptable. Uh, Oh, that's really nice, Helena. What a great idea. I think you're responding to how to deal with mixed levels, right? Mixed abilities. Do yes, no questions first, and then maybe move into open WH questions after. That is a really nice idea. Okay, I'd like to move on to the next section now. Thank you very much for your questions. It is an excellent idea. It's not my idea. I stole this from another trainer. I wish I was clever enough to come up with this kind of stuff on my own. But I was at a conference last year, and I saw this activity, and I thought, ooh, this is a great idea. So I'm just passing on the knowledge. I wish it was mine. If it was mine, I think I'd probably start writing books at this point. So the next step is delegating task creation. And what I mean by delegating task creation basically is this, right? Getting students to think like an examiner and create some short exam-like tasks on their own. And this is a nice way to add a little bit of variety to a typical kind of course book lesson, which we'll look at in a moment. But what I mean by this is taking a tape script and asking students to write one or two multiple choice questions from that tape script, and then doing the listening to check, right? When they don't answer their own questions, they answer questions that another student or another parent has written. So the idea is with 3 options or 4 options, 1 true, 2 false. One of the false answers should also be a distractor. And this is a nice activity that can introduce students to the idea of distractors on listening and reading tests, and to get them to practice creating those distractors themselves. And in my experience, students get into that part of the activity a lot more than I kind of expected. Especially teenagers that I've taught, they really want to kind of trick their classmates and see if they can fool them with a really good distractor. So this type of activity, in terms of the flow, where it could fit into a lesson, you can take a page like this from a course book, and you can just add it in, right? So you do the activity as prescribed by the book, or you do the activity in the course book kind of as is, right? Stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, and then after that, the production activity is to create a multiple choice question or 2 multiple choice questions. With a text this short, probably just 1, right? 1 question per student or 1 question per pair would be even better. And they quiz each other, right? They can quiz each other. They can pass the questions around. They can read the question to the whole class. It's really up to you in how to organize that stage of the activity. And the feedback for that is, were the questions accurate, right? So were they grammatically accurate? Were they exam-like? And this is where some exam kind of training comes in and familiarizing students with what these exam tasks actually look like. So was the question exam-like, and did it provide a distractor? And was the distractor a distractor, or was it just basically a correct answer disguised as a distractor? When students really get into it and try and fool their classmates, they might actually end up with 2 kind of correct answers, right? It's possible. So this type of activity can be added to a normal kind of course book to provide a little bit of variety, and also to get students thinking more like examiners. So it can work well with reading and listening, writing open and closed questions, probably just gap fills, right, in terms of closed questions, multiple choice. It could be for open questions as well. In use of English, one interesting thing that I tried is giving students different copies of different texts, right, short texts, and asking them to blank out 10 words or 8 words in that text for use of English open-close practice. So they blank out the words. Again, this is where the training comes in, because they have to blank out grammar words, not content words, right? Or if it's a content word, it needs to be part of a phrasal verb, for example. So getting students to think like examiners in terms of what words go in those gaps. Ask them to do the gaps themselves, and they swap with the partner and then do the activity. It's a nice way to do some of that really challenging use of English practice, or that type of practice, right? Those open gap fills that can be really challenging, I think, for students, and challenging for us as teachers to develop and to get students thinking in terms of language structures. It's very challenging. In terms of writing, getting students to think like an examiner, they can generate topics and using student texts in class as well, which we'll look at in a moment. But what about speaking, right? What about the speaking paper? I mean, how can we really get students to create a sort of speaking exam task? And one idea that I had was taking a typical kind of part 3 from Cambridge First or Cambridge Advance. This is a typical kind of part 3 where they collaborate, they have to speak together. And then part 4, if you remember, if you're familiar with those Cambridge exams, part 4 always has questions related to this topic that kind of take the topic that they see in part 3 into a broader sense, right? How this topic affects society, or different kind of topics there. And we could ask students to try and create some part 4 questions. And then using those part 4 questions they've written, they can interview another student. So again, asking them to create some of these questions is kind of getting them to think like examiners. And it could be useful for lots of different parts of the exam. Okay, the last thing that we're going to look at today is marking writing efficiently. And the idea here is goes back to enjoying the course, right? one thing that stops me from enjoying my job, and I give myself homework, right? I think we all know that giving students writing for homework could mean that we're giving ourselves homework as well in terms of marking. And I'd like to show you a system that I use for marking papers, which is efficient because I feel like it saves marking time. It's also efficient because it turns over some of the marking to the students themselves. And basically it's a way of asking students to correct their own work. And there's been a lot of research done in linguistics and error correction, what methods are effective, which methods are not. And the research that I've read all basically says marking writing, getting out your red pen, correcting every mistake, putting a score at the top and giving it back to students is not effective in terms of students improving their writing. Because they look at it, oh, this should be written this way, and they put it away and don't really think about it again. Or maybe they can't even read our writing sometimes. So I'm going to show you an alternative to that system, which really suits standardized testing for a few different reasons. And if we think about standardized exams, I mean, a lot of us here, I think a lot of us are teaching to different exams, right? There's lots of different tests out there, but standardized exams have some things in common. They're standardized because they're structured, they're formulaic, and they're structured in the same way, right? They're marked objectively. This is also going to be key to how this system is effective. If you think about reading and listening, for example, it's pretty objective. There's one answer. With use of English, sometimes you have two options, but it's right or wrong. There's no big question. But with speaking and writing, in theory, it's subjective, but we're all human. Even people who mark standardized exams, believe it or not, they're human as well. Maybe some of you mark exams as well. I have no idea. And in terms of writing, most standardized writing exams are marked in these four areas or some variation of this form. So content, did the student address all parts of the question? Accuracy, I think, is obvious. Range, using a variety of grammatical and lexical structures. And finally, organization. So does it contain paragraphs? Does it have linking devices? Is it coherent? Is it cohesive, right? All these things is essentially how writing is marked, right, in some way. And one way we can address these areas is by answering these questions. How do you mark writing? Which areas do you correct? And what about mixability groups? So we're going to look at how to address those areas by addressing these three questions. And the exam task we're going to look at is writing a review. So your task is to write a review of a place you visited recently, right? Restaurant, museum, hotel, whatever it is, to write a review. And this is something I did with my students towards the beginning of the semester. I have some students who, I live in Poland, they're all foreign students. They were all kind of new in Poland, so they'd been experiencing and seeing lots of new places. So it kind of suited their learning context quite well. And question one was, how do you mark writing? Well, this is what I do. I take a sentence from each composition, but I stop when I get to 8 to 12 sentences. 10 is a good number, but more than 12 in the activity, it's extremely time consuming. So 8 to 12 is a pretty good number. And I put them on a worksheet, or write them on the board. And then I put students in pairs and tell them, fix the mistakes, right? Find the errors and correct them. So it looks something like this. These are from, I don't remember if it's from my B1 or my B2 group that I did this exercise with most recently, because these groups are very, very mixed. I mean, I feel like the levels are almost completely abstract in some way. My B2 group is slightly better than my B1 group, but they're both completely mixed. So I had a worksheet that looks something like this. Now, the second question is which mistakes do you correct, or more accurately, how do you choose the sentences to put on the worksheet? And I try and choose errors that are repeated by the same students, or repeated by multiple students. I try my best to choose errors in students' language system, systemic errors, right? Not slips, not little kind of mistakes. For example, the third person S, right? This is a big problem in Poland, where I live and where I teach. All my students know the third person S exists, but they have a really hard time using it. So I personally don't feel the need to draw their attention to it when they write. Okay, because normally if you put that on your worksheet, it's a very easy, quick fix, and to be honest, doesn't have a huge effect on improving their writing in that way. So I try and go for more systemic errors. Any kind of emergent language that comes up here is a really good indicator of something you should put on a worksheet. Emergent language being when students try to use a verb tense, for example, that they are not quite sure about yet, but the meaning is there, but they've got the wrong form, for example, right? This would be a good thing to put on one of these error correction worksheets. I try and include some good language as well. So if I have 10 sentences on my worksheet, I might put on 2 that include some nice pieces of language. I also include unnatural language and improper register, which means the worksheets that look like this, they're not just full of mistakes, but they're full of language that needs to be improved, needs to be reformulated or upgraded to make it sound more natural, to use the proper register, or excuse me, more natural, proper register, or using accurate collocations, for example, or a wider range of grammatical structures. So this is how I choose sentences. And the next question, which a lot of you probably have in your mind, was, well, what about mixed ability groups, right? Because if you give this to a group of students, I mean, they created this, that these are their sentences. So probably if they wrote it, they probably think it's correct, right? Which is kind of an inherent sort of problem. But we still need to improve students' writing somehow. So instead of just giving them a worksheet like this, some of the things that we can do, let me just skip ahead. We can do something like this. We can draw their attention to certain types of mistakes or the number of mistakes that were made. And let me go back one slide now. That's what it could look like. And essentially what we're doing here, we're showing students what type of mistakes, how many mistakes there are. They can do it in pairs as well, and I often repair my pairs. So students get 5 minutes to work with one person, 5 minutes with someone else. So they end up getting, instead of that blank worksheet with no extra support, they get something like this. And I chose G and V as just grammar and vocabulary, but I use things like S for spelling, C for collocation, VT for verb tense, P for punctuation. I mean, there's lots of possibilities out there, right? This is one option. A better option, or an option to provide even more support for students, is this. And you just simply underline up the place in the sentence that needs to be either corrected or improved or upgraded in some way. So I mentioned these 2 groups that I was teaching. With my B1 group, this is what I do. They get the worksheet with portions underlined, so they know where to look. With my stronger group, I might give them this first. They can work on this for about 5 minutes with their partner, and then I'll either project or underline on the board where the mistakes are, and they can look again. There was a question, do you mark the type of mistakes on the I think it's supposed to be margin. I underline it, or if I do this way, I do it just like this at the end of the sentence. I put in brackets either a number or the type of mistake there is, just the way it looks here. This is exactly the kind of thing my students would get. So this is a system which I think provides a lot of feedback for students. It gets them to think about what they've written. And it also gives us a little bit of extra time. We don't have to mark every single mistake in every composition because it's not effective, right? It feels like the right thing to do. I mean, I want to do that as well, but I also want to enjoy my job. I want to enjoy my free time, and I think this is a better system for a lot of reasons. And the key is to have a system and use it, right? Train your learners. If you're going to use letters that represent different types of mistakes, train your learners in what those mean. Give them some examples. Spend 10 or 15 minutes showing them what these different types of mistakes are with examples, right? And then give them the worksheet, for example. But be consistent and don't forget to raise the level of challenge, right? You can start with something like this, and then you can move up to make it more challenging until eventually you've got a worksheet with no additional help, and they're looking at finding the mistakes on their own, right? This is one way excuse me, to I think to mark writing efficiently and to make the most, right? To make the most of your marking. And the idea being work smarter, not harder, right? We don't need to correct every single mistake, especially when it's more time consuming, and especially when the effects of doing that on our learners are not really what we're going for. Okay, so are there any questions? This is the question portion of the webinar, the official question portion. So if you have any questions, please put them in the chat box. I'm just going to read back through and see if there's any that Helena Rogers, a problem with post pictures is often articles. Do you work on that specifically? Yes and no, Helena, yes and no. Articles are a really tricky area. I could talk to you about articles for the next 30 minutes. I won't, of course, but I will include articles on my error correction sheets, for example. And I will do an article kind of review or an article lesson once per semester, or if it continues to be a problem, it's a really hard area for students to improve on. So I don't overdo articles, but I do pay some attention to articles. They need to see the right solutions. Yeah, Sadvera, that's a really good point. They do need to see the correct answers, and part of the feedback, which I totally forgot to mention, after they work on these corrections with their partners, you can project, or you can give them the corrected versions, or you can go through each sentence with corrections, which can be, that format can be kind of time consuming because there's more than one correct answer for a lot of these, or not just one correct answer. But you're absolutely right. And if you do this activity for making corrections, for students correcting their own work, they absolutely have to walk away with a written record of the correct version of the sentences, because we don't want them to internalize the mistakes. It's very important that they walk away with the accurate sentences. That's a very good point. When can we start with exam preparations at school? Miriam, if you're teaching exam course, for example, that begins in September or October and finishes in June, exam preparations in terms of exam practice can start quite early, but not before learners kind of know what to expect on the exam, right? We looked a little bit earlier at some things that students should know before they go into and start doing exam practice, showing them some different task types, familiarizing them with marking systems, making sure they know what types of words go into gaps, for example. Let's see, months. Okay, that's a good point. I don't give grades on this. No, I don't. I might grade their individual compositions. And the grading system that I use for exam writing was kind of showed earlier in the webinar, or some version of it, with content, accuracy, range. Let me see if I can find that slide. That's usually how, and I assign points to each of those categories. Here it is. In these 4 categories, I would say roughly 5 points for category, and I'll give them a score for content, accuracy, range, and organization. So when students hand me compositions, I make an error correction worksheet, and what I give back to students is their paper with CARO with points in each section. That's how they can get kind of a grade. Well, the Cambridge criteria, Helena, is good for Cambridge exams, right? Obviously, for Cambridge exams, you should use Cambridge criteria, but I don't think everybody here is teaching an exam class that uses a Cambridge exam. And the webinar today is for all exams, not just for Cambridge exams. But when you know the specific criteria for your exam, that's what you should use, absolutely. Yeah, Simon Palmer, do you try and mark writing to the exam bands or just point out errors? No, for exam writing, marking it based on the bands, right? If it's a Cambridge exam, giving them the 3.1, 3.2, 3.3, absolutely, right? They need to have that kind of feedback to know kind of where they stand in terms of their exam score. So using the bands as well. When I was doing this for Cambridge exams, the raw score out of 20 points, or maybe it was 25 points, was convertible to the exam bands. Any ideas for giving feedback after a full mock? Yeah, tutorial is one way. These one-to-one meetings with students is one way to give feedback. And I think you might be asking that question because when students actually do exams like Cambridge exams or state school exams in high school, they get little to no feedback on their performance, right? They get a score sometimes, maybe with a few comments. If you guys have seen the scoring sheet that like Cambridge provides, for example, it's very minimal, right? It's not much in terms of guidance. So mock exams, absolutely, after running a full mock exam, I would take points away from students writing and speaking to cover in class, and potentially go through each part of the paper in different lessons. That's one way to give feedback after a full mock exam. How can students relax during the exam? They just have to be perfect in English. That's how they can that's how they can relax. Obviously, I'm joking. I mean, I'm not like a meditation guru. I mean, I often kind of tell my students that knowing the format of the exam, especially some people were mentioning Cambridge exams, especially for Cambridge exams, knowing the format and the marking criteria is like 50% of passing those exams. So I try and train my students as best I can, not only in English language, right, but also in these exam strategies. And I try and convince students that once they find a strategy that works well for them and they know the structure of the exam, that should help them to relax. Who should carry out the tutorial? The teachers should. The teachers, because the teachers know the students, right? So it should be the teachers. There's another question. We have to finish up in a moment. Do you administer mock exams? Yes, I do administer mock exams. Big, full mock exams. Usually around this time of year for a May exam date. Okay, guys, thank you very much for all of your questions. It's been a really, really fun webinar from my perspective. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope you got some ideas that you can take away and use in your classrooms. And hopefully you'll have some good techniques for different ways you can relax a bit and enjoy your exam course. So once again, thank you very much for coming. Again, my name is John Wolf. It's been a pleasure. Take care. Goodbye.